How far is former Trump lawyer Michael Cohen going to distance himself from Donald Trump? Well, today, Trump's former lawyer hired one of the top lawyers for the Clintons. A plot twist that you'd never believe in a movie about this era. But yes, I can report to you that Michael Cohen hired none other than Lanny Davis, who defended Bill Clinton during impeachment and has been a loyal advisor and surrogate publicly for Hillary Clinton and her campaign. The New York Times reporting Cohen preparing for a potential legal onslaught from prosecutors and a potential PR onslaught from Trump associates. The implication is that they'd have something to create an onslaught about, maybe Cohen flipping. He recently fired his lawyers and brought on a veteran of the federal prosecutor's office in New York as well. And a friend of Cohen telling CNN, I brought up the idea of a Trump pardon. He said, I don't think so. I just don't think so. He's certain in his mind he has been dismissed. According to the friend, Cohen also said, I don't know what to think anymore. So Michael Cohen goes from being Trump's most famous fixer to hiring a Hillary Clinton loyalist and talks up his plans to the media. And that's not all. While everyone was hopefully enjoying the July 4th holiday, that's the time Michael Cohen picked to go to Donald Trump's preferred medium, Twitter, and change his bio from personal attorney to President Donald J. Trump to something very different, a link to his professional page at LinkedIn, which notes that he stopped serving as Trump's lawyer and stopped serving as an executive at the Trump Organization. I'm joined now by Mimi Rocah, a former federal prosecutor, who's a fellow at Pace University Law School, and Matt Miller, a former spokesperson at the DOJ under Eric Holder. Matt, any one of these things may be overinterpreted. All of them together, what do you think?
It certainly looks like Michael Cohen is moving towards cooperating. One of the things about people who are involved in these type of investigations, if you've ever known anyone who's been caught up in an investigation or represented people caught up in them as I have, is that there is a distancing that has to take place. First, there is a very real practical distancing where subjects of investigations aren't allowed to talk to each other anymore. Their lawyers tell them to communicate through attorneys. So there's this physical distance. And then there becomes an emotional distance eventually where you see the subject, or in this case, most likely the target of the investigation, Michael Cohen, finally realize that their interests diverge from the interests of their friends, their associates, the people that they might otherwise protect. And when that happens, that you see this kind of psychological break where they start to look at their interests first and decide that they're going to have to do what's best for them, what's best for their family, which is, of course, the words you saw Michael Cohen use in his interview with George Stephanopoulos last week. So when you take all this together, it does, along with the very serious legal jeopardy that he seems to be in and the very limited options he has, it does look like he's moving towards, cooperating when the investigation gets to that point.
Mimi, when you hear Matt talk about the emotional distance, these certainly are trying times for anyone looking at federal jail time and then that kind of liability, and the search on his material plus whatever he knows about what's in there speak to that. And yet, at the same time, he hasn't been charged.
He hasn't been charged, but I think, all signs point to he's going to be. And, while prosecutors don't usually announce that ahead of time, they've done that in as many ways here as they could by executing, as we've discussed before, a search warrant that would have required such a high threshold that they wouldn't even have gone in if they didn't have pretty good evidence. And then we know from, this special master process that they got so many more documents. But remember, they just got those million-plus documents turned over to them. So they're going to need to wrap their arms around those before they charge him. And it may be that they're not in a position or really wanting to meet with him, even if which he seems to be willing to meet with them now, because they want to get get those documents and really dig into them before they meet with him, because he's going to be a cooperator if he becomes one, that they are going to want to test his credibility extensively. And the best way to do that is to know your evidence and know your documents ahead of time, even better than the person you're questioning.
Matt, what did you think when you heard the Lanny Davis piece of all this?
Yeah, look, so I've come across and dealt with Lanny at times in politics, as you probably have covering politics. He is a lawyer, but I doubt very much he's been hired as an attorney here. He's been hired. He's a crisis communications expert. And what I think that means is he's got probably two jobs. One is he's going to have to start working on trying to rehabilitate Michael Cohen's reputation. I talked about what the kind of stages that potential defendants, subjects, and targets of investigations go through. One of them is this real sense of being aggrieved when they read all these things about themselves in the press every day and have have very little ability to respond because their lawyers are telling them, be quiet, you have to wait while this investigation proceeds. So I think you'll see Lanny at some point out trying to, put whatever best spin he can on whatever it is that Michael Cohen did.
But isn't it, I mean, just to get into the point, though, isn't it amazing that he's going for a Clinton person? I mean, what you just described, just for anyone at home listening, goes, okay, sure, a PR and having a lawyer do the PR who might even have attorney-client privilege is one way to do it. But there's a lot of lawyers who fit that bill who aren't Hillary people.
Yeah, it's exactly right. And he certainly could have found plenty of people in New York, plenty of people in Washington who could do that very same job. My guess is, someone like Lanny Davis has been through this kind of high stakes politics. Remember, he worked on the Clinton impeachment for President Clinton. So he's worked kind of in this similar context where you have an investigation that touches on the president. So if Michael Cohen finds himself, at war with the president's people coming after him because he's cooperated, Lanny Davis is the type of person who you could see going on TV to represent Cohen, to push back, talking to reporters. Lots of times talking to reporters in ways that don't actually show up in the in the newspaper, not in a named way, to try to push back and defend his client to some extent.
Rudy Giuliani, who is much more of an insider now than Cohen in this world, gives this statement out, telling Business Insider he doesn't make anything of this move to hire Davis, and, quote, he should have the attorneys who he has the most confidence in, Giuliani says. What do you think of the fact that there's so many ghosts of 90s past doing all this?
Yeah, look, Guy Petrillo was hired to be the white-collar criminal defense lawyer for this, clearly. The fact that he hired someone so close to Hillary Clinton, I mean, we've been talking about messages that Michael Cohen was sending in his interview. Was he asking for a pardon, this and that? And on this, I respectfully disagree with Michael Avenatti. I do not think he was asking Trump for anything. I think he was telling Trump, and he is again now with this, I'm done. I'm done with you. And as I think Matt made the great point, I think he feels it's almost like his breakup. It's his version of breaking up with Trump. He needs to do it in a semi-public way, make his statement. He's also trying to gain supporters. And who are the people who are going to support Michael Cohen right now? Hillary Clinton supporters.
But
and
legally,
fans.
he doesn't need supporters, right? I mean, legally, the most important thing for him is clearing his liability, not where he lands in our polarized.
Right, legally, absolutely.
Fight.
But this is clearly a man who cares about his image. And, I have said all along, I think that if and when Michael Cohen does cooperate, he will make a great cooperator. And this is part of why. He is someone who wants approval. He wants to be part of the crowd, the in crowd. For a while for him, it was Donald Trump, and he had his utmost loyalty. Now it's going to be Team USA, and he is going
You're suggesting almost like a John Dean type thing. I mean, in that era, Dean was, of course, the enemy as a Nixon guy until he wasn't. When he flipped over time, he became a kind of a hero.
Absolutely. And I think Cohen is trying to remake himself into that. And cooperation, very likely will be part of that. One thing we have to keep in mind, though, and I hate to be Debbie Downer on this, but the one thing about the cooperation, it does matter what he has to give. Not everyone gets to cooperate. We're all assuming he has something. I think he probably does. But, it depends how big it is and how useful it is to the government.
I don't think that makes you Debbie Downer. I think that makes you Debbie
Trying to be realistic.
Legally precise, which doesn't have the same ring to it. But certainly the credibility and the supplemental information that he has goes to how valuable he'll be. Mimi, Debbie Downer, Rocha, do we want that to stick or not? Matt, you don't get a nickname tonight.
We'll think about it.
I'll survive.
Sorry, buddy. The control room saying gotta go, which just means they don't like these jokes. Thank you both for your legal expertise.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.